All right, so 5.4 is all about the inverse trigonometric functions. So these basically do the exact opposite of what we did before. Um, on the other ones, we knew what the angle was and we could figure out what the ratio had to be. And now this is, if we know the ratio, can we figure out what the angle is? So a couple things. Here's the definitions of inverse sine, inverse cosine, and inverse tangent. Again, sometimes you might hear them called arc sine, arc cosine, or arc tangent. Um, but one thing to make sure you notice when we use this notation, it's sine to the negative 1 power. That is not actually to the negative 1 power. Just like when we have f inverse, how that's not 1 over f of x, that's not f to the negative 1. It's written that way, but it's f inverse. This is sine inverse, so it's not the same as 1 over sine. Remember, 1 over sine, as we learned the last section, is the same thing as cosecant, right? So sine inverse is not 1 over sine. So do not make that mistake, even though it's kind of that notation. Now, we'll explore these a little bit more. Again, once we see different definitions in Chapter 6, they might become even a little bit more clear to you. But for now, basically recognize that in order to figure out what inverse sine, cosine, or tangent is, we can only plug in things between negative 1 and 1. We'll see why later on, but just recognize that we can't plug in anything bigger than 1 or smaller than negative 1. And it will always spit out a number between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2, or if you want to think in terms of degrees, negative 90 degrees and 90 degrees. For inverse cosine, between 0 and pi, or 0 and 180. And for inverse tangent, you can plug in whatever you want, and the range is the same as inverse sine, except notice it does not include the endpoints, whereas inverse sine does. All right, so to evaluate, for instance, inverse cosine of 1/2, we need to find the theta in this range above here between 0 and pi, such that cosine of theta is equal to 1/2. So last two sections ago, I mentioned there are some triangles that you want to memorize, those two special triangles. Well, so here's one, and we see the 30, 60, 90 triangle. If I look at which of these angles would give me a cosine equal to 1/2, remember cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, so I want 1 over 2. So 1 is adjacent to 60 degrees here, so I see that cosine of 60 is 1/2. Therefore, inverse cosine of 1/2 is 60 degrees, which we can convert to radians to get pi over 3. So again, inverse cosine of 1/2 is basically saying what angle, when I take the cosine of that angle, is going to give me 1/2. I see that 60 degrees is that angle, so that's how I get that answer. And it's very common to have to use our calculator for these. There are ratios like 1/2 square root of 2 over 2 and root 3 over 2, or 1, or 0, or things like that. Those are ones that we should recognize kind of from our special triangles. Anything beyond that, and we'll have to use our calculator. But just make sure if you want your answer in degrees, that your calculator is in degrees. If you want your answer in radians, make sure your calculator is in radians. What might be the easiest way to do it, since your homework a lot of times requires exact answers, would be to do it, have your calculator in degrees, and then convert yourself from degrees to radians.